The 2024 Senate map is extremely difficult for the Democrats, to say the least, since there's a number of states in which they're going to have to be defending their incumbents. Now, one of the most difficult states for the Democrats of all is probably the state of West Virginia, which went to Donald Trump by almost 40 points back in 2020 and is a solidly Republican state both on the federal level and the statewide level. And of course, incumbent Senator Joe Manchin, even if he was to run for re-election in 24, is likely to have an extremely uphill battle and is almost certain to lose his race. So we're going to go into the dynamics of this Senate race and why this is near impossible for the Democrats to actually win, provided the Republicans run a solid candidate against Joe Manchin. So we're going to get into all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So as I mentioned before, West Virginia is a near Trump plus 40 state. It's one of the most Republican states in the entire country. Every single county in the state went to Donald Trump back in 2020. And of course, despite all of that, it still has a Democratic incumbent senator in Joe Manchin. Now, Joe Manchin's been in the Senate since 2011. He won a special election back in 2010 to replace Robert Byrd, who had passed away. And really since then, he's been in a comfortable position in his Senate seat, really until the Trump era. And then, of course, after that, it became a lot more difficult to hold on to power here. Now, for some context, West Virginia was previously once an extremely Democratic state. From the 1930s onward, it was pretty much a solidly Democratic state on the statewide level. Went for Democrats for president for the most part from the 1930s all the way down until 2000, in which George W. Bush won the state of West Virginia. And really ever since then, West Virginia has been voting for Republicans for the presidency. Now, on the statewide level, the transition from blue to red was a little bit slower. The state legislature still stayed solidly Democrat, really until the mid-2010s. Of course, after the 2014 election, a lot of the blue dog Democrats in West Virginia lost to the point where now, in 2023, the Republicans have 31 seats in the state Senate as opposed to 3 for the Democrats, and 88 seats in the state House as opposed to 12 for Democrats. So the Democratic brand is near extinct in West Virginia, barring Joe Manchin himself. And now, Joe Manchin was very popular in the state of West Virginia up until a couple of years ago. Of course, if we go back to some of his past elections, he was often reelected by pretty wide margins. Again, back in 2012, despite Mitt Romney winning the state of West Virginia by nearly 30 percentage points, Joe Manchin ended up winning his re-election bid very comfortably, 60-36. So really not a contested race. Only 3 counties going to the Republican in this case. And then, of course, you had in 2018 a much closer race. And this is really because of the political polarization that we've seen around the entire country. Federal politics became local politics, and the Kavanaugh hearings really were the top issue on a lot of voters' minds when this election came around. Now, ultimately, Joe Manchin did vote for Justice Kavanaugh, but had he not, there's a very good chance he might have lost his re-election back in 2018. But I think because he did, I think that was the one thing that actually did save him in West Virginia. Again, this was a state that voted for Donald Trump by nearly 40 points back in 2016, but yet re-elected a Democratic senator by over 3 points. And, you know, not to mention, Joe Manchin underperformed the polls pretty dramatically. He was up against Patrick Morrisey by a much wider margin in every poll that we had in 2018. And then ultimately, you know, this was an underperformance for him. Now, going into 2024, as I mentioned, it's going to be extremely difficult for him to be able to hold on. And now, obviously, if Joe Manchin does not run for re-election, this race will be safe Republican no matter what. No Democrat that isn't Joe Manchin is going to win this race. But looking at some of the hypothetical polls that we have, Jim Justice, the current Republican governor, seems to be beating Joe Manchin pretty comfortably. Now, I don't really take any stake in polls, especially given the fact that these are really early on, but they are somewhat of a small indicator as to what we could expect in the future. Other Republican nominees, Alex Mooney and Patrick Morrisey, not performing nearly as well. Jim Justice, I think, for the Republicans is the safe bet. If he is to run for this seat, I don't think there's any way that Joe Manchin will win re-election in 2024. Now, Joe Manchin, of course, hasn't made a decision yet. It's still pending. His decision is expected by the end of this year. That's probably the filing deadline for West Virginia. But ultimately, If Joe Manchin gives up this seat to the Republicans and decides not to run, that will put the Republicans at 50-50 with the Democrats. Democrats will have a questionable majority. It really only depends on who wins the presidency. If Joe Biden is reelected in 2024, then they'll hold on to the Senate, of course. Of course, in that scenario, Montana and Ohio would go to the Democrats, but regardless, it's not really a position the Democrats want to be in. And even if they do defend Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia, they're still at 51-49. Their situation really doesn't change all that much. Obviously, Sinema and Angus King I've put as blue on this map purely because they caucus with the Democrats and are basically Democrats in everything but name. But the Democrats really will have a difficult time keeping control of the Senate in 2024, especially since we're going to have presidential level turnout. And Joe Manchin hasn't run in an election with presidential level turnout since 2012. And of course, things were a lot less partisan on the statewide level in West Virginia in 2012. Again, if we pull up the partisan table of West Virginia, Democrats still held on to control of the legislature pretty comfortably. The state Senate back in 2012 was 28-6 Democrat. So this was still a largely Democratic state on the statewide level. Obviously, that's why Joe Manchin did so well here. Obviously, as an incumbent, that also surely helped him. But he doesn't have that advantage anymore. And Joe Manchin is one of the least popular senators in Washington, mainly because he's put in a really difficult position. Democrats don't really like Joe Manchin because he sometimes votes with the Republican Party on certain issues. And of course, Republicans don't like him because he mostly votes with the Democratic Party on a lot of key pieces of legislation. So, of course, going into this election, winning is already going to be difficult when the Democratic base in West Virginia really isn't that enthusiastic for you. Obviously, Joe Manchin is going to get a decent amount of crossover support from some Republicans who like that he's been a major roadblock to the Biden administration. But ultimately, I think more Republicans are just going to vote for the Republican nominee at this point than vote for Joe Manchin. Again, Joe Manchin and the situation regarding Trump and federal politics was much different back in 2018. Again, despite everything, he still barely held on to his seat in a blue wave year. 2024 is probably going to be a very different environment for him. And ultimately, I don't think he's going to win in 24. And if Republicans win the seat in West Virginia, they're at a 50-50 tie with the Democrats, barring they don't lose any seats. Now, the only seat that could remotely be competitive, I think, is the state of Texas, and that's because Ted Cruz has said he wants to run for re-election. I think he filed for re-election. And, he's not a very popular senator. I still give him the leg up. It is Texas. It is a Republican state, but I think it really depends who the Republican nominee for president is. If Donald Trump is the nominee in 24, which at this point is looking ever more likely, especially since he's been rising in a lot of the primary polls. And I'll make a separate video talking about the Republican primary thus far because I really haven't talked about it. And a lot has happened since the midterms regarding the Republican primaries, and we're certainly going to cover it a lot more closely. But Donald Trump is much weaker in the state of Texas, and I'll talk about the Texas Senate race at some point in the future, but I certainly think if Trump was at the top of the ticket, his performance in Texas would likely be worse than 2020 and probably drag Ted Cruz down, potentially making him lose this race. Now, obviously, you need a very strong candidate on the Democratic side, but it does make things quite vulnerable. But there's a lot of ifs in that statement. That's really the only seat that's remotely flippable, I think, for the Democrats. Every other state, they're on defense. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, West Virginia, Montana, Arizona, Nevada. These are all states that could conceivably be competitive that the Democrats are going to have to defend. Now, they do have some strong incumbents. Obviously, you've got Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, very strong incumbents. Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona is now an independent, so even if she does decide to run, Ruben Gallego is probably going to be the Democratic nominee, very progressive, left-wing Democrat. He might have some challenges in a state like Arizona that's more centrist, but going up against a more extreme right-wing candidate, somebody like Carrie Lake again, I think is really going to benefit the Democrats. So ultimately, this is going to be tough for Democrats to hold regardless. Even if they do win all of the states, they only got 51 seats. That's basically their ceiling at this point. Of course, West Virginia being almost a given for the Republicans puts Democrats at a 50-50 tie. And if, the Republicans are able to flip Montana, flip Ohio, they're already at 52 seats. So it's very, very difficult for the Republicans to lose the Senate in 2024. Now, again, we're 2 years out effectively from the election, so a lot could happen. But, you know, it seems like at this point in time, it's very difficult for the Democrats to hold on here. And West Virginia is probably one of the worst states you'd want to have a Democratic incumbent, considering it's near impossible in the 2024 environment for a Democrat to win. Now, that being said, Joe Manchin is probably the only Democrat that could actually win West Virginia. So at least if he's in the race, Republicans are going to have to put a little bit of money in the state of West Virginia in order to knock him off. But if some other no-name Democrat decides to rise up and run for Senate, whoever the Republican nominee is going to win very comfortably. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out today. And I mentioned today because there will be another video coming out today on the Pennsylvania Senate race and Doug Mastriano's intentions there. So as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.